In northern Arizona, there exists a geological formation so precisely defined, so mathematically regular, and so fundamentally at odds with everything modern geology claims about riverine erosion, that the official explanation has begun to crack under scrutiny. The Grand Canyon, we are told, was carved by the Colorado River over the course of 6 million years. A river cutting downward through layer after layer of ancient rock, patiently grinding away stone, widening its channel, deepening its bed, creating the vast chasm we see today through the simple mechanics of water flow and sediment transport. But when you stand at the rim and look down, when you actually examine the walls, when you study the photographs and geological surveys published by the institutions that promote the erosion theory, the story begins to collapse. Because the Grand Canyon does not look like it was carved by a river. It looks like it was cut with precision, cut with intention, cut by something that knew exactly what it was doing. The evidence is everywhere, written in stone, visible to anyone willing to see. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The walls do not taper. They are sheer. They are steep. They are cut at angles that suggest engineering rather than accident. The rock layers do not match up across the canyon in the way they should if a single river had simply worn away the intervening stone. There are layers that appear on one side and vanish on the other, then reappear downstream, as if something had selectively removed sections of the canyon's walls. And then there is the matter of the Colorado River itself, a river that is far too small to have created the canyon it supposedly carved. A river that flows through the bottom of a gorge that is over a mile deep and up to 18 miles wide. A river whose discharge simply does not match the scale of the canyon that contains it. This is the beginning of a 30-minute investigation into what the Grand Canyon actually is, how it actually formed, and what the geological establishment has gotten so catastrophically wrong that they have had to spend the last 150 years defending a theory that the evidence itself refutes at every turn. We are going to walk through the canyon wall by wall, layer by layer, and ask the questions that no mainstream geologist will publicly ask. Admitting what the evidence actually shows would require acknowledging that something happened in this canyon, something engineered, something that does not fit into the current model of planetary history. Let us begin with the basic geometry. The Grand Canyon, rim to river, descends roughly 5,280 feet, 1 mile. The distance from the highest point on the rim to the lowest point at the riverbed is slightly over 5,000 feet of vertical drop. The canyon ranges from 4 miles wide to 18 miles wide, depending on location. The walls are steep, nearly vertical in many places. The angle of repose, the steepest angle at which loose material remains stable, ranges from 30 to 45 degrees. Yet the Grand Canyon walls stand far steeper than that. In many sections they are nearly perpendicular, 90 degrees, straight up. Now consider what a river does when it erodes a channel. The river flows at the bottom. As it cuts downward, the exposed banks above it become unstable. Gravity pulls the overlying rock toward the water. Water seeps into cracks in the rock face. Freeze-thaw cycles expand and contract the surface layers. Weathering breaks down the stone. The result is a canyon with sloping sides. Not vertical walls, sloping sides. The angle of the sides increases the higher you go up the canyon wall because the rocks get older and harder. But there is always slope. There is always evidence of the talus, the broken rock debris, that piles up at the base of an eroding slope. The Grand Canyon does not have that. The Grand Canyon has vertical walls. Walls that rise from the river as nearly perfect lines when viewed from across the canyon. Walls that stay vertical for hundreds of feet, even thousands of feet in some locations. Walls that do not show the irregular pattern of erosional debris. The mainstream explanation for this vertical wall phenomenon is that the rocks at the Grand Canyon are particularly hard and resistant to weathering. The Vishnu basement rocks at the bottom are essentially impervious. They stand vertical because they are too hard to fail in any other way. But there is a problem with that explanation. There are places on Earth where rivers cut through equally hard basement rocks. The Deschutes River in Oregon cuts through basalt. The Rogue River cuts through granite of equal hardness to the Vishnu rocks. The Inca Trail follows stone-cut channels through some of the hardest rock on the planet. And in every single one of those cases, the river channel does not feature the kind of sheer vertical walls the Grand Canyon displays. The walls slope, the rocks fracture, the debris accumulates. The channel has the organic geometry of water erosion. The Grand Canyon does not. The Grand Canyon looks like it was shaped by an instrument, a cutting tool, something that removed stone with precision and left behind walls too regular, too straight, too geometrically perfect to be the result of random erosion. Now let us talk about the rock layers. The Grand Canyon is famous amongst geologists because its walls display an almost complete stratigraphic record. You can see layer upon layer of rock, from the Precambrian at the bottom all the way up to the Permian near the rim. Each layer represents a different geological epoch. Each layer is a different color, different composition, different density. The Muav limestone, the Bright Angel shale, the Redwall limestone, the Tapiat sandstone, layer after layer, stacked like pages of a book, telling the story of billions of years of planetary history. Except the pages do not always match up on both sides of the canyon. Geologists call this the problem of lateral continuity. If a layer of rock is deposited horizontally across a region, and then a river cuts through that region, the layer should be visible on both sides of the canyon. The layer should be at the same elevation on both the north rim and the south rim. The layer should continue across the canyon as a continuous band of rock, with the river simply cutting through the middle. And for the most part, this is true. The Grand Canyon does show clear lateral continuity for most of its major layers. The Redwall limestone forms a prominent red band that extends across the entire width of the canyon. Anyone standing at the rim can see the Redwall on both sides at roughly the same elevation. But there are anomalies. There are sections where layers do not maintain their expected lateral continuity, where a layer clearly visible on one side is missing on the other, where the vertical continuity of a layer is interrupted as if the stone had been selectively removed. The classic example is the Great Unconformity, the boundary between the Precambrian Vishnu rocks at the bottom and the Tapiat sandstone above. According to the geological timeline, this represents a gap of nearly 1.5 billion years. The Vishnu rocks were formed during the Archean and Proterozoic eras. Then, for an immense stretch of time, no rock formation occurred in this region. Then, at the beginning of the Cambrian period, the Tapiat sandstone was deposited on top of the eroded surface of the Vishnu rocks. The problem is that the Tapiat sandstone is not eroded flat. You would expect, if 1.5 billion years of erosion had occurred, that the surface of the Vishnu rocks would be worn to a nearly flat plane. The later deposits would rest on top of this flat surface, but they do not. The Tapiat sandstone sits on top of the Vishnu rocks at various elevations. In some places, the contact is nearly horizontal. In other places, the Tapiat's layer cuts down at angles as if it had been deposited into a pre-existing channel already cut into the Vishnu rocks. Geologists have proposed various explanations for this anomaly: wave erosion, ancient channels, Paleozoic rivers. But none of these explanations account for the precision of the cuts, or the way the Tapiat's deposits sometimes sit in channels too regular to be the result of random water erosion. The alternative interpretation is much simpler. The channels were cut. Not eroded over time, but cut in a single operation, using a tool or technique capable of removing large quantities of stone with precision and regularity. But let us set aside the Great Unconformity and focus on a more recent problem. A problem involving the quaternary layers at the top of the canyon walls. Modern geology recognizes that the Grand Canyon has been deepening throughout the Quaternary period. The Quaternary is the current geological period, the last 2.6 million years. During this time, the Colorado River has supposedly been cutting deeper into the canyon, further excavating the already massive chasm. But the Quaternary deposits, the river terraces that mark the former positions of the river at different elevations, do not show the pattern you would expect from continuous downward erosion. If the river has been steadily cutting deeper for the last few million years, you should see a clear sequence of terraces. Terraces at various elevations, each one lower than the last, marking the river's progressive descent. And you do see terraces. The Grand Canyon has multiple terrace systems. But some of these terraces appear at elevations that do not fit the chronological sequence. Some older terraces sit higher than younger ones. Some younger terraces sit lower than older ones in ways that do not match the expected pattern of progressive river downcutting. The conventional explanation is that the terraces formed during different climatic episodes. Periods of increased rainfall when the river was higher, periods of decreased rainfall when the river was lower. The terraces mark the equilibrium elevations during these different climatic regimes. But the alternative interpretation is that the terraces are not erosional features at all. They are remnants. Remnants of what was once a much deeper and wider canyon system that has since been partially filled in. Consider the physical appearance of these terraces. They are flat. They are at relatively consistent elevations for long stretches of the canyon. They show evidence of water deposition, but not of active erosion. They look like they were the result of water action at a specific elevation for a specific period of time, followed by a change in conditions. Not like they were formed by the progressive downward cutting of a river actively deepening the canyon. The easiest explanation for this pattern is not that the Colorado River has been engaged in a complex dance with climate for millions of years. The easiest explanation is that the Colorado River is not the agent that carved the Grand Canyon. The Colorado River is what is left, the river that remains after the real work was done. The river that flows through the canyon and provides some level of erosion and maintenance. But the river that did not create the canyon in the first place. Now let us address the Colorado River itself. This is perhaps the most damning evidence of all. The Colorado River, measured at various points throughout its course, has a discharge ranging from about 4,000 cubic feet per second during normal flow to over 190,000 cubic feet per second during floods. The average is roughly 30,000 cubic feet per second. In erosional terms, this matters because erosive power is a function of water velocity and volume. The Colorado River is not a particularly erosive river. It does not carry an extraordinarily heavy sediment load for a river of its size. It does not have the velocity of water found in steeper mountain rivers actively cutting through rock. It is, by most measures, a moderately sized river for the region, constrained by its environment, limited by the aridity of the lands it passes through. And yet it supposedly carved a canyon that is 1 mile deep, up to 18 miles wide, and 277 miles long. The volume of rock removed is estimated at between 500 and 900 million cubic meters, taking the lower estimate, 500 million cubic meters of rock, moved, removed, transported somewhere by a river that today does not have anywhere near the erosive power required to accomplish such a task. The conventional response is that the climate was different, that millions of years ago the Colorado River was much larger and much more powerful, that the Colorado Plateau was higher, that the elevation gradient was steeper, that the river had more water and more energy. But the evidence for this higher, more powerful Colorado River is entirely theoretical. It is inferred from the existence of the canyon itself. In other words, the canyon is taken as evidence that the river must have been more powerful, because obviously the current river could not have carved it. But the existence of the canyon is the phenomenon that needs to be explained. You cannot use the canyon as evidence that the river was more powerful if the whole question is whether the river could have created the canyon. The sediment discharge of the Colorado River provides another clue. The river carries sediment, all rivers do. This sediment is measured regularly. Scientists monitor the amount of material the Colorado River transports downstream, and the rate has been measured for over 100 years. The data is clear. The Colorado River transports roughly 150 million tons of sediment per year in its lower reaches. Now, if the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon by erosion, then all of the material that makes up the Grand Canyon should have passed through the Colorado River and been transported downstream. 500 million cubic meters of rock. This material should have been transported as sediment, carried down to the Pacific, and deposited in the ocean. But the sediment load of the Colorado River has not increased. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. It has not changed dramatically over the last century of measurement. The river carries roughly the same amount of sediment whether the climate is wet or dry. The amount of sediment the river carries is consistent with the amount of erosion currently occurring in the Colorado River Basin. It is not consistent with the idea that a river had to transport the entire volume of the Grand Canyon as sediment. The conventional explanation is that most of the sediment from the original canyon carving was removed millions of years ago, that the river transported enormous quantities in the past, but does not do so anymore because the canyon is no longer actively deepening. But this requires assuming that the sediment transport capacity of the river has decreased dramatically over time, without any clear mechanism explaining why. It requires assuming that we have no geological evidence of where all that sediment went. The marine geology of the Pacific does not show a distinctive influx of Colorado River sediment during the times when the canyon should have been undergoing its most rapid carving. All of this points in a single direction. The Grand Canyon was not carved by the Colorado River. The canyon exists. It is real. Its walls are made of rock. Its depth is measurable. Its geology is well documented. But the mechanism of its formation is not riverine erosion. Something else created the canyon. Something with different properties. Something with different power. Something with different precision. Now let us talk about what that something might have been. The first thing to recognize is that the Grand Canyon is not alone. The world contains many canyons. The Yangtze River gorges in China, the canyons of Switzerland, the canyons of the American West. Most of these canyons show the expected characteristics of river erosion: sloping sides, irregular walls, evidence of weathering and debris accumulation, organic chaotic geometry, but some do not. Some canyons around the world show the same characteristics as the Grand Canyon: vertical walls, straight cuts, layered walls that do not maintain lateral continuity, geometric precision that seems incompatible with water erosion. The alternative researchers have begun to ask whether these canyons are the result of a technology that is no longer in use. A technology that was capable of cutting through rock with precision. A technology that was deployed in the distant past and then abandoned, leaving behind evidence that modern geology cannot adequately explain or account for. The Tartarian framework suggests that a global civilization existed in the relatively recent past. A civilization with advanced technology. A civilization that left behind the monumental architecture visible in 19th century photographs. A civilization that vanished, was written out of history, and left behind remnants that the modern world misinterprets. If such a civilization existed, if it had technology capable of moving Earth on a massive scale, if it had tools capable of cutting through rock with precision, then the Grand Canyon is exactly the kind of project such a civilization might undertake. The Grand Canyon is not a utility or settlement, but it could have been created as part of a much larger infrastructure project, a water management system, a geological modification project, a regrading of the land itself to facilitate the movement of water or the management of geological forces. The Tartarian civilization would have had access to technology facilitating such work. There are hints of such technology in the monumental works left behind in the 19th century. Structures built with precision impossible for the population and resources of the era. Domes built with no visible means of support. Towers erected to heights requiring steel frame construction, but built using masonry alone. Stonework showing tool marks incompatible with hand tools. The Grand Canyon in this framework is a geological signature. It is a scar left by an ancient tool. A scar demonstrating the scale and precision of technology that the modern world no longer possesses. But there is another possibility. The Grand Canyon could have been carved by a geological event, a catastrophic event, an event so large, so rapid, and so powerful that it could remove the volume of rock comprising the canyon in a relatively short period of time. Not millions of years, not steady erosion, but catastrophe, sudden release of energy. A single event, or a series of related events that fundamentally altered the geology of the Colorado Plateau. The catastrophist school of geology, marginalized in mainstream academia, proposes that Earth's history has been shaped as much by catastrophic events as by gradual processes, that impacts, floods, electrical discharges, and other sudden phenomena have played a role in shaping the planet's surface that conventional geology underestimates. A catastrophic flood, released from a massive impounded body of water, could have carved a canyon. A Missoula flood could remove enormous quantities of rock and soil in weeks or months. The Grand Canyon could be the result of a similar event. A catastrophic release of water from a source no longer evident. A source that either drained into the sea, reabsorbed into the ground, or evaporated into the atmosphere, leaving behind only the canyon as evidence of its passing. The problem with this interpretation is that it introduces uncertainty. It requires accepting that the planet's history has been shaped by events we cannot directly measure. It requires abandoning the principle of uniformitarianism, the idea that the processes we see happening today are the only processes that have ever happened. But the Grand Canyon itself is evidence against uniformitarianism. If you accept the uniformitarian principle, if you accept that small, steady processes explain all geological features, then the Grand Canyon should not exist. The Colorado River is too small, the time periods are too short given the sediment transport data. The walls are too vertical. The lateral continuity of the layers is too irregular. By every measure that matters, the Grand Canyon violates the expectations of uniformitarian geology. So either the Grand Canyon is an anomaly, a feature that does not fit the theory but is explained away with special pleading, or the theory itself is incomplete, or the theory is wrong. Let us examine one more line of evidence. The matter of the rock at the bottom of the canyon. The Vishnu basement rocks at the base of the Grand Canyon are among the oldest rocks on Earth. They are metamorphic rock, meaning they were once sedimentary or igneous rocks transformed by heat and pressure deep within the Earth's crust. The Vishnu rocks were metamorphosed during the Archean Eon, more than 2.5 billion years ago. They are hard. They are dense. They are among the most erosion-resistant rocks on the planet. But when you examine the Vishnu rocks at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you notice something odd. The rocks are not randomly distributed. The Vishnu rocks at the bottom form relatively flat bedrock. Bedrock exposed to the river. Bedrock that shows tool marks. Tool marks. This is not a metaphor. Geologists and geomorphologists who have examined the Vishnu rocks have noted the presence of marks on the rock surface. Marks that appear to be the result of something other than natural weathering. Marks that appear regular. Marks that appear to be the result of a cutting action. The mainstream interpretation is that these marks are striations. Marks left by rocks embedded in glacial ice during the Pleistocene ice ages. During the last ice age, much of North America was covered by glaciers. As they moved, the rocks embedded in the ice scraped across the bedrock beneath. These scraping actions left stria, parallel lines on the rock surface, but the Grand Canyon is in Arizona. The southernmost extent of Pleistocene glaciation in North America was in the northern parts of the present-day United States. The Grand Canyon was not under a glacier. The rocks at the bottom were not scraped by glacial ice. The mainstream response is that even though the Grand Canyon was not beneath a glacier, the region experienced freeze-thaw cycles during the Ice Age. Water seeped into cracks in the rock. The water froze and thawed repeatedly. These cycles widened cracks and broke up the rock. The repeated freezing and thawing process left marks on the rock. But freeze-thaw marks do not create the kind of organized striations observed on the Vishnu rocks. Freeze-thaw action is random. It produces irregular fracture patterns. What produces the organized striations observed on the Vishnu rocks is cutting. Cutting by a hard object moving across the rock surface in a controlled, directed manner. The kind of cutting produced by a tool, a very hard tool, moving back and forth across the rock, multiple times, in parallel lines, creating the organized pattern of striations that has been observed. The alternative interpretation is that the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the Vishnu rocks upon which the river flows, is a work surface, a surface that has been cut, a surface that shows the marks of the cutting tool. Now, as we piece all of this evidence together, a picture begins to emerge, a picture radically different from the official narrative. The picture shows a canyon with vertical walls, walls too regular to have been formed by water erosion, walls that show the evidence of cutting, of directed, controlled removal of stone, walls that stand as monuments to precision engineering. The picture shows a canyon whose width and depth are incompatible with the erosive power of the Colorado River, a river too small, too sediment-light, too consistent in its discharge to have accomplished the task attributed to it. A river that is insufficient for the work supposedly done. The picture shows a canyon whose rock layers do not maintain the lateral continuity expected from a simple scenario of river erosion. Layers that appear and disappear in patterns suggesting selective removal of sections of the canyon walls. Patterns that defy random erosion. The picture shows a canyon with a bottom of worked stone. Stones that bear the marks of cutting. Marks that are organized, parallel and incompatible with natural weathering. Marks that speak of purpose and intention. The picture shows a canyon that exists at the intersection of two major rivers, in the middle of a high plateau. Positioned in a way that would have created a node of water management infrastructure if such infrastructure had been built. A location that allows access to water at a significant elevation. A location that could have been developed as a key component of a larger system. The evidence, taken together, points to a conclusion. The Grand Canyon was created by something other than water erosion. It was created by a tool, or a technique, or a technology. Something capable of cutting through stone with precision. Something capable of removing the volume of rock that comprises the canyon. Something that operated in the recent enough past that evidence of its action is still visible in the rock. The question of what that something was remains open. It could have been a lost civilization with technology we no longer possess. It could have been a catastrophic geological event of a magnitude we no longer experience. It could have been something we have not yet imagined. But what can no longer be reasonably defended, what can no longer be accepted as an honest explanation, is the idea that the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon through gradual erosion over millions of years. The evidence does not support that claim. The geometry does not support that claim. The sediment data does not support that claim. The river itself does not support that claim. What we are left with is the canyon itself, real, vast, visible to anyone who travels to Arizona and looks at it. The canyon exists. The question is not whether it exists. The question is how it came to exist. And that is a question that the mainstream geological community has failed to answer. Failed because they have locked themselves into a theory that requires them to ignore the evidence. Failed because they have made assumptions they will not examine. Failed because they have accepted explanations that do not stand up to scrutiny. The Grand Canyon is waiting. Its walls are open, its layers are visible. The rock at its bottom still bears the marks of the tool that cut it. Until the geological community is willing to acknowledge what the evidence actually shows, rather than what the theory requires, the true story of the Grand Canyon will remain hidden. Not lost, not forgotten, but hidden behind the weight of institutional commitment to an explanation that the canyon itself refutes at every turn.